Welcome to Open Vision, the space to look beyond. This podcast is an invitation to think like a cathedral builder, to dream far, act now, and know that our individual efforts become part of something much greater, even if we may never see the end result. Here, we explore systems, stories, and structures that shape our world and reimagine what is possible. In this episode, I'm joined by Daniel Hires, a systems thinker, social entrepreneur, and the CEO of Impact Calling. Daniel is someone who lives at the intersection of inner transformation and systemic change. He's helped build the Inner Development Goals framework and is known for weaving regenerative leadership and collective wisdom into complex ecosystems of change. Born in Asia and raised between Germany and the US, and now living in Barcelona, Daniel brings a truly global lens to what it means to lead, not from the front, but also from within and along the sides. In this episode, I really wanted to pick Daniel's brain and heart on what it really means to navigate complexity wisely. We explore new paradigms of leadership, the humility of not knowing, the power of language, and the unexpected gifts of serendipity and laughter. This is a conversation about systems, yes, but also about being human within them. Enjoy. In our prior conversations, we talked a lot about leadership and in particularly visionary leadership, and kind of feel that we came to a conclusion that said that, well, the whole leadership thing, it kind of also opposes the power of collective wisdom and co-creation. And so you said something very interesting about what happens when we stop putting the spotlight on these lone visionary leaders or almost heroic leaders. And how can we do that in the sense of empowering ourselves as a collective to really make change as well?
There's something in me that is that this is not the real leadership that we need in our time, that actually this kind of old style, visionary, almost sage on the stage type of leadership is not what we are really called for. And I often think about this kind of quote by Thich Nhat Hanh about that the next Buddha might be the Sangha, might be all of us, and that there is a much more collective idea. And I think there's quite a lot of resonance in the general culture around this idea that the future is a bit more collective. Because, yeah, if we look at what have the visionary leaders brought us today, I think when we look into Silicon Valley and the metaverse and the crypto bros and, all these kind of tendencies, I think that's where the visionary leadership has, that's what it has given us. And so I think that we need to come together in different types of structures, because if we're just trying to replace those old visionary leaders with just new leaders that have a new vision, I think we're still playing the same game. And so I think that we kind of look at leadership not as something that happens on the top of a pyramid, but that leadership happens all along a network where people are inviting others to step into their full selves, to really voice their opinion, to include them. I think that oftentimes is the real work of leadership that we need, because I think that probably the next best idea is going to come more from the edges rather than the centers of power.
Immediately also makes me think about when we talk about decentralized leadership, which happens on the outside, there needs to be an internal shift as well, because so often what I've seen also in, for example, agile transformations is that, yes, we want to empower the group. Yes, we want the group to co-create and do it together. But internally, still those more traditional structures of, for example, a pyramid, they exist, and people feel internally the need to manifest themselves as a leader or within a hierarchy structure while they're trying to make it a more level playing field. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the theory always sounds easy. And if we're talking about a shift that we want, it's easy to forget that we are still living and embedded in the old system, right? I mean, there's the quote about Henry Ford's workers came to work probably by horse or by walking. And so I think that's really important that we don't apply too much of this purity test, I think, that can sometimes happen. And so I don't think that we can be prescriptive here, that everyone needs to figure out in their own context what fits, what works for them. And perhaps one thing that we can do to help people is to try to tone down a little bit some of the personal criticism. I think it's of course great to point out when there are certain patterns that are happening, when there are certain kind of structural issues that are at play, and then also to try and see that we're all human, we're all fallible, we're all going to make mistakes, and we all are, or most of us are, suffering some kind of battle that is perhaps not seen by everyone. I think one way that we can bring more people into that collective leadership lens, I think, is to try to tell multiple stories that can exist kind of almost at the same time. The way that I call this concept is that we can have a polyculture of ideas, where I think today oftentimes there's this monoculture almost that leads to very simple ways of how can we look at how much value something is generating. And if we look at it on a one-dimensional scale, it's really easy to say these are the top contributors and these ones not so much. There's different forms of value. They all don't go into one nice and neat quantitative scale, and that we learn to understand how can we value things that are a bit more on the qualitative side than the quantitative.
Do you have an example, maybe in your line of work, where you've seen or maybe even facilitated that shift to being more relational and to also being more open to different ideas, different paradigms, rather than just the monolithic perspective?
I think these spaces are really rare, because I think that wherever you are in certain opinions or topics, I think there is oftentimes a centrifugal force, a force that kind of brings opinions together, not always intentionally, but just because it feels good as a group to have some kind of common identity, to like get into this almost us versus them. And sometimes in order for us to feel like we have a shared identity, it's very easy to then define what are we not.
But then you also obviously have the risk of creating echo chambers.
But one example that I would have, I think, is perhaps the refugee community that I met in Germany. And I think in the general society, there was always this picture of, these are all refugees and we classify everyone in the same pot. And of course, these people come from very different backgrounds and circumstances, belief structures, systems, classes, and they didn't identify as one homogeneous group.
No.
And yet they had to make it work. I mean, the German system put them all together in these kind of refugee homes or camps or different types of structures, and they often had to make it work. And of course, it wasn't all without conflict, and sometimes that would boil up. But what I would see there is that people very quickly adjusted and adapted to living with very different cultures, not even door by door, like curtain by curtain, because that was often the structures. And so I think that is one place that I think that was really living this idea that, yeah, we have different truths, yes, but we also have one shared truth that we're trying to support each other through.
I'm thinking about this as what they call like a third culture kid. You feel at home in different places and maybe also nowhere because of that.
Yeah, I identify as a third culture
right?
kid.
Yeah, this is what I'm thinking. And I think there's quite a few principles that guide our behavior, but probably also these refugees, they need to find a way to coexist and live together and hopefully also thrive. And that's based on a couple of principles. And I was wondering if we could maybe dissect a few of those. Also being ourselves third culture kids.
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, one thing that has been more and more true for me is I think when I'm thinking about these topics of impact and how can I live my purpose, that I am thinking more and more that it's a very limited view to think of my purpose as only as a function of the organization that I'm working in, and more of how am I? How am I showing up? What is my being in the way that I'm relating to others, and showing up in the world?
Yes.
So I'm thinking that one of the strongest impacts that I could have in the world is actually to not react to the person that might be yelling at me in the street, but that I'm starting to remember and seeing the child in that person that has just accumulated layer over layer of trauma, and that is what is actually yelling at me. And that if I can take a moment to pause and not directly react to that, and then perhaps pass it on to the next person that I see on the street, or take it home to my family, or just lash out at that person directly, but to break that chain and to show compassion to other people, even if perhaps there is a version of me that thinks they don't deserve it, I think that could be one of the most powerful ways that we could really change and make an impact. Because I think when I look at systems change, the message that I often get is, yes, it is also about working on the parts, but what's really important is that we work on how the parts relate to each other. So of course I can work on myself and improve. I can bring in these initiatives and try to do things differently. But I'm also very mindful of how important is it how we show up to each other, and are we able to forgive each other? Are we able to have compassion to each other, even in our weakest moments?
I wrote down compassion over judgment, and really seeing people or approaching them
Yeah,
as
and
children with layers of life that formed them and shaped them and sculpted them.
yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, I think that doesn't mean that we discount accountability.
Yeah.
Obviously, there is accountability for people whose actions have horrible consequences. And, we shouldn't rob people completely of that agency. But I think that if we go and try to look underneath that, of what often is at work here, I think more often than not, we'll see that it's hurt people hurting people.
I'd like to add to that also. When I introduce myself, sometimes as a third culture kid, people are like, okay,
Yeah.
so what does that mean? And I say, well, so I have family in different parts of the world with very different cultures and nationalities, etc. And growing up, that made me realize that what's normal here may be bizarre overseas, and vice versa. So what is normal actually really doesn't exist. And therefore, always to approach things with curiosity rather than with judgment. So I think we could add that to our list of principles. Being curious
Yeah.
and then acting out of compassion. But also, like you say, that doesn't mean that you're not holding people accountable. Mostly in this series, we talk about impact being more so the notion or awareness of that your actions have consequences. And if you do that well, then you create positive impact in the world, which is what we love to see, obviously.
At least now with age, that I think is becoming more and more visible to me, is that there is a certain hubris to think that we can really understand the full impact of anything.
Yes.
I mean, looking at what kind of second, third, fourth order ripples any action can have in a system, I think that it becomes very blurry sometimes. I suppose that you're familiar, or a lot of people out there are going to be familiar with the Tom's Shoes case, where they said, well, you buy a pair of shoes in the Western world, and then we'll ship a pair of shoes to Africa. And not realizing that what is a mark, or what does it do to a market to be flooded with a bunch of free shoes? It puts all the shoemakers there out of business, and then in the end everyone's going to be worse off. I mean, this is just one example of so many where there's unintentional systems effects. Yeah, I think I'm very careful to think about that, and at the same time I think it's so important that we at least try to get a picture of what are the actions or what are the consequences of the actions that we're actually taking. Because what I often see in impact is that we're just kind of tallying the score on the positive side while keeping a little bit of a blind eye on the negative externalities. And I think that is something to me that if we want to get into a really regenerative mindset, we need to take a good, honest picture on the overall tally.
Let's go back, because you used the word hubris, and hubris is this almost like an arrogance or superior mindset of saying, you know what, I know everything and anything.
Yeah.
And so you say the oversimplification of impact, or in the impact space, that people say, well, we're making positive impact because we do X, Y, and Z. There's a lot of culprits in there. So as a systems thinker, how do you approach that hubris? Why do you think it exists even?
Well, I think it exists because that is what there's a lot of demand for. I think people like to see a simple story of, if I push this button, then this is going to happen. If I fund this initiative, then I'm going to get this outcome. And I think there is this need for certainty that is driving this, because if that's what's in demand, that is what organizations are going to offer. And I think that, most smart social entrepreneurs that look around are going to see people who make great claims, make great offers, and that is what then gets the funding. That is what gets the media hits. That's what gets people to be invited to podcasts, to stages, to actually share their voice. I mean, we can just look at the Forbes list and how many of those have made outsized claims. And as long as they are able to deliver at some point, that works out. But if the house of cards ever collapses, it collapses quite a bit. And I mean, we can see that logic, I think, in the general economy. I mean, what is a startup if not a bunch of really good sounding promises with some hopefully reasonable analysis behind that, and then a funder giving money to hopefully realize that vision? But we all know that 95% of the time it doesn't work out. But this is, I think, the operating model of at least the startup and innovation economy.
What is needed to move away from bold claims to actually delivering on promise?
To me, I really see a lot of value in my life on the topic of serendipity. And so that's, I think, also how I would approach this topic. I mean, I think still a lot of the work is good. I don't think it is a bad thing that we aspire to do something that perhaps we haven't built yet or that isn't quite ready. I think the correction is more in how are we selling it, and perhaps show a little bit more humility and acknowledge the role of pure luck in this. I think a lot of times when people ask me or come to me, I very often say, I was just lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And it's very little skill involved in all the things that people might think that I have accomplished. And I really see how it was luck, maybe a little bit of mindset and some way of how I like to put myself out there in luck's way, so it doesn't just pass. But I think that if we could acknowledge that a bit more, I think that would help us on the one hand with the hubris, and I think on the other hand explain a bit more of what is actually at work.
Let's talk about luck a little more, because you say serendipity, your gut, and luck. I'm reading this book now by Deepak Chopra. It's from 1995. It's called The Wizard's Way. So he talks about magic a lot, but Deepak Chopra. So immediately I'm thinking about that. Luck kind of feels like magic in a way. What does it mean to you?
So I think a lot of people think about luck as something that happens to them and they can only play a passive role. And I really love this book from Christian Busch. It's called Connect the Dots, because when I read that, I just recognized that this is not really the only story that we can tell ourselves about luck, and that this alternative story is something that just kind of flowed naturally with the way that I often showed up in the world. I am open to the idea that luck might happen. And so that's why when luck or something that could be seen as lucky would actually happen to me, I would be willing to take a little bit of risk to step into that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we can quite often see that the way that or the way that we think about the world is oftentimes then the limit of what we can perceive. So I'm not talking about a simplistic way of manifestation and that if I every morning just think about that Ferrari, one day it's going to magically show up in my driveway.
Yeah.
But I am saying that if you do not believe that that Ferrari could one day be in the driveway, it will sit in your driveway and you won't even go out to look for it. And so I think that is the first thing, that you have to have a belief that good things can happen, even if you might not quite understand how they could happen,
Yeah.
but that you do not deny that this could be a reality.
Yes. Yes.
And then I think the second step is that you understand that, well, you also need to do something for it, and you can increase your chances of certain things happening. Of course, the more people you talk to about a secret wish that you have, or a hobby that you like to do, or something that you really appreciate, the more likely it is that they're going to have a brother, a cousin, a mother that might be able to connect you to someone who knows someone who in the end can make certain things happen. And so I think we need to put ourselves out there. Like the book calls it, talks about hooks for like someone to latch on to that and luck to latch on to that.
Yes.
And so that's a lot of how I think about it too, that we need to put ourselves out there. Luck doesn't happen to you sitting only at home and not engaging and connecting with the world.
Yeah. Wonderful. I love what you're saying, like getting out of luck's way and really being open and sharing those hooks. And that made me think about impact and what we talked about before. We cannot really define what impact is. And we can also not say, well, beyond these horizons, the impact will be X, Y, and Z. That's hubris, right? But if you're opening the door to luck or you're getting out of luck's way, this is when serendipity happens, especially when you listen to your gut. And that's also how impact happens, I think. And that's why we cannot explain what impact really is. Not to say that you cannot do research and have clear data on impact, that also, but the how and how people are brought together or how paths cross, luck also plays a role in that. It's definitely a factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is what a systems lens does, that you very quickly see that if we want to do something on that impact scale, that it is a collective effort that is bundled, and that is departing a little bit from that old hero story.
Well, talking about cathedral thinking, there's the construction worker who is building the cathedral because it's his job. There's the other one that is feeding his family. And then there's the other one who says, you know what, I am contributing to this amazing cathedral that will be here one day. Or was there a fourth one as well? I forgot.
I think it was 3, yeah.
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 You talked about impact and what that means and how you can grow the seeds, not by force, but by nurture, and also I think with patience as well. When we think of cathedral thinking in a sense of we're contributing for something larger and probably we won't witness the end result, still we're here. We can live with compassion and openness, and that is also already impact. How do we build that cathedral in a way that feels good today, but also gives us some peace of mind and saying, you know, what we're doing today is also for the betterment of future generations to come?
I love that idea, first of all, of cathedral thinking. I think it's so important to remind ourselves of these projects that are going to outlast our lifetime and that are going to contribute to something bigger than us. And at the same time, there is something about a cathedral for me that is very static. I think that I don't want to completely dismiss that thought and that idea. And I think there is something in me that is almost more important than building the next cathedral. So, and that ties in again to this idea of what real impact is. I think that if we're recognizing that there are certain intergenerational trauma patterns that are kind of at play over the years, and that are not, or they're repeating themselves seemingly, just perhaps with different pieces or different parts of the system, different technologies at different times, but that the pattern underneath is oftentimes reminiscent of something that happened in the past, or at least it rhymes. I think that if we really want to get out of those cycles, that there is something additional that we have to do. And I think, to me, that building of a cathedral is almost reminiscent of a time where we wanted to immortalize us, where we wanted to kind of put some symbol out there into the world to feel like we have some lasting significance. I think it also ties into this idea of legacy and what am I leaving behind. And I think that it's great to think about your legacy if that helps you come out of that very short-term, narrow, individualistic focus that we can sometimes have, and that we think about, all right, what is it that I'm leaving behind for the next generation? But there's this concept of 7-generation thinking that comes from some indigenous traditions. And I think it's really interesting that it's not just about the physical artifacts that we leave behind, but also the relationality and the abilities to relate to one another that they're often talking about.
It's so interesting. So from my African lineage, I think in a lot of African tribes, there's this role really within communities of the storyteller. And the storyteller, kind of like in, I think, Western folklore, is the person who shares these stories not only to kind of keep history alive, but also to learn these cultural and communal lessons of how you treat one another, what life is. It's very philosophical also. It's very layered, right? It's different meaning for an adult than for a child. And in that sense, I think this is really a testimony to those tribes that are so strong and have gone through centuries, is that they keep those stories alive. And I almost feel that that's like the fabric that binds them together as a unit, as a tribe, as a culture, as a group of people. And so in a sense, that is also a cathedral. And it's intangible, it's invisible even, but it's very much present. And it's of everybody as well.
I think that's beautiful that is so explicit.
Yes.
And one thing that it made me think about a recent conversation about, it started out with this idea that, have you ever heard this quote that science advances one funeral at a time?
Oh gosh, no. Please enlighten me.
And I mean, it's this idea that, of course, in science, we always try to criticize certain things, and that we like to disprove theories of what we thought before, and that is in a way what the scientific discovery is. However, underneath there, oftentimes there is a certain paradigm that gets reinforced. And that because it's so difficult sometimes for us to move away or even to be aware of certain paradigms that are at work within us, that a renewal of the paradigm can happen once the old guard has made space in their positions, because oftentimes they are the directors, they are the gatekeepers of what knowledge is actually getting visibility.
Yeah.
And I think that is not only at work in science, that is at work in a lot of fields where people who perhaps, in their youth, they were the rebels and came up with like new insights. And then now they've moved into positions of power, but now they've almost shifted to the other side where they're keeping out others, sometimes even limiting advancing the field. And so I think that could be something that could be really helpful as a society, that we could reimagine that kind of idea of what it is to be an elder in our society, and that allowing people to demonstrate their value and then let go of, that role that they have been clinging on to for 20 years of their life.
Yeah. I love also the idea of reimagination, right? It's not, nothing is set in stone. We can always look beyond and say, hey, maybe we can shift this a little bit, or maybe we can change that a little bit. Maybe I can change in that field, and that will also bring about something new that is beneficial to most of us. I don't know. I think a lot of generations, including that of my own, I'm a millennial, we sometimes feel that things are as they are. And so we have
Yeah,
to work with what we got. And then I'm
yeah,
like, well, no, that's why I love innovation, right? There's always something new that we can create. And I'd love to always explore what's outside of, or I say I like to color a little bit outside of the lines of what's possible. And
yeah.
there's a lot of things that are possible.
Yeah, I'm also an old millennial, and I feel that at work with me as well, that there is something in me that when a younger colleague comes and would like to try something out, that there is this like reaction that is inside of me that is like, we've tried that and it didn't work, and I just want you to avoid a mistake.
Mm.
And I think it's really important that we let people make those mistakes,
Oh,
because
yes.
especially with these uncertain times that we're moving into, if we acknowledge that this is a complex situation, something that might have not worked last year might just work out really well this year.
Definitely.
Something in the way that it's implemented might just have changed. Perhaps it is just, I played some kind of role in it not working. And if I'm not involved in it, maybe it will. That I think I can also see at work, that when these people who have made a career or been in a certain position for a while are kind of letting their fears
Mm.
determine of what kind of actions are acceptable and not acceptable, what risks should we take, that also takes a toll out of young people's ambition, idea of their own agency and ability to respond.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think of the outcomes that we're going to see, because none of us really can understand what is the outcome of a certain action if this is really such a complex environment that we're in.
Very true. And also, I think failure, not to say that you should fail a lot, but I think there's a lot of lessons that you can learn, or even innovations they can develop through a failure. As a side effect, almost, some things were born in a failing experiment, and they were actually the solution.
Yeah, and I think that we cannot know about success if we don't know about failure. I think that these stories of the CEOs that are part of the 5 a.m. club are worth nothing if we don't look at a control group of other people who also get up at 5 a.m. and might have not been so successful. So I think that we really need to understand, what is it called? The survivorship bias. That
Mm.
if we're only looking at those successful examples, we're really not having a control and not understanding what are things that actually work and what are things that kind of everyone does or many more people did and it wasn't part of their success story.
When we talk about the wisdom of the crowd or collective wisdom and group co-creation, rather than having this heroic leader on the top of the pyramid, it's hard to sometimes open those rooms up to a larger group of people. And language, I think you mentioned, that also plays a part in that.
Of course, there is a part of language that is an authentic self-expression. And I also understand that language needs to connect with one another, because what I care about is that transmission of meaning more so than using a certain like word that to me is just kind of a signifier
Yeah.
of a more abstract concept.
So you say language is a means, or communication is a means to relate to the other person and build a connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's really easy to understand when you think about some kind of disagreement or argument that you have in your private life, may it be a partner or a friend, that oftentimes if we win the argument, we have lost on the relationship scale.
Mm-hmm.
Like that cost us from that kind of relationship budget, if that's what we think about, that cost us to win at that argument. And that the quickest way to replenish that is also just to lose the next argument and to apologize, to say that you're wrong, to acknowledge that. And I think that there is oftentimes that trade-off. And I think that we need to make a conscious decision of when do we want to improve the relationship. And there may be also cases where it's just really important to be right. By winning the word argument, we might be losing the relationship.
Yes. And not only losing a relationship, but also not opening the door for other perspectives. I think that if you use certain type of language, some people don't feel invited to join the conversation. I am thinking of these fishbowl sessions, right, where you have two rings of people, and then the inner ring is where the conversation happens, and the outer ring is of the observers, but they can also participate if they like. But you also have to feel that you're invited to join or participate, but also to really understand what is going on, right? What is being said? What is the meaning of this conversation? Language is a very important thing.
I think that language can sometimes serve as a gatekeeper as well, that it can exclude people and include people. And I think sometimes when I'm in circles that are very complexity aware, sometimes there can be this idea that we are this unique club of people that understand complexity because we have the right words for it, or have put together certain phenomena into a thing that we have named, and that someone who doesn't know the name of that might just not understand the thing. And so I sometimes am this voice in these inside circles that tries to remind people that, no, actually, this is not something that, only we have an understanding of. We just have the vocabulary for it.
Yes.
And I think that this in itself can quickly become a blind spot when we then think that the ability to have that language is a qualifier to participate into that change process. Yes, of course, it's a bit difficult maybe to be part of that dialogue, but does that mean that we exclude these people, or does that mean the dialogue needs to change and to be more accessible? And I would even almost be willing to argue that there are some people who are participating in that dialogue that might just know the vocabulary and might actually have less experience and less kind of real knowledge of the actual underlying concept than people who didn't even know the name of that concept but have lived it.
I've been following a training in Socratic design or Socratic dialogue. And what's so wonderful about those sessions is that you're forced to really listen to understand instead of listen to respond. Because after each person says something, a random person in the group is asked to, in their own words, give a recap of what that person said. And it's like, this is my understanding of what you said. And then the other person gets the chance to correct or edit a little bit, and then we continue the conversation. And so it forces the group to really understand, what am I hearing and what is this person meaning by using those words? And so that allows for everyone to actually be a full and equal participant in the conversation. And it also is a very good filter to sometimes people, they have to correct themselves. And so all of the complexity is gone. And what's left is really what you're meant to actually say.
I think it takes a lot of courage for people to admit, hey, I don't understand what you just said. And I think a lot of misunderstandings could be avoided if we had a bit more courage to do that.
Yes. This is, again, going back to our principles, or some of our principles, curiosity.
Yeah.
And there's no shame in saying, I don't know this, but I'd like to learn. I think that's where growth happens, not only for one person, but also for the group.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason that we're here is not to impress each other by how smart we actually are. And I realize the hypocrisy of talking about that on a podcast that is going to be heard by other people in the ideal case, but that we're just here to play and to try things out. And we don't always have to be right. We just want to be here for that human interaction of engaging with each other in a way where we hold certain things lightly.
Yes.
And Yeah, I think that can be an easy way to help us to not take things always so seriously and kind of find that courage to ask the question when you don't understand.
Well, on that note, I'd say laughter is our universal language.
Yeah.
It's such an essential part of our lives as humans, to laugh and to love. And yeah, we shouldn't forget that in all of the seriousness of the impact business.
Yes.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and for illustrating that true leadership today doesn't come from lone heroes, but from compassion, openness to multiple perspectives, and the courage to stay connected in complexity. We explored polyculture, how more than one truth can exist at the same time, that making an impact is often about care, humility, and presence, and that success has as much to do with serendipity and trust as it does with planning. We also touched on how impact is complex, sometimes intangible, and difficult to measure, yet still vital to account for. Being data-driven matters, but so does staying open to the less visible, more human layers of what impact truly means. And perhaps, most importantly, that language matters. That the quickest way to lose a relationship is by trying to win the argument. Thank you for listening to Open Vision. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, and keep building your cathedral. And never forget to laugh. It's our universal language.